August 25, 1944. Chartres, France. A German Army Group B supply officer reviewing the latest intelligence report on the American logistics system that is supporting the pursuit across France. The pursuit that has been advancing faster than any German defensive plan has been able to organize a response to, at a pace that the German supply planning said the Allied logistics system could not sustain, but that the Allied logistics system is sustaining, writes 3 words in the margin of the report, and underlines them twice. Das ist unmöglich. It is not possible. The numbers on the page, compiled from aerial reconnaissance reports, from the signal intelligence that the German intercept service has been collecting from American logistics communications, from the prisoner interrogation reports that have been describing the American supply situation with the frankness that American prisoners bring to their discussions of logistics, describe a trucking operation delivering 500 tons of supplies per day across a 400-mile one-way route using approximately 6,000 vehicles that should, by every principle of the German military logistics system's vehicle utilization formula, and by every operational precedent that the formula's calibration data has been assembled from, be consuming themselves faster than any maintenance organization can repair them. The supply officer is Hauptmann Karl Reuter of Army Group B's quartermaster section, a logistics professional who entered the Wehrmacht Supply Corps in 1939 and who has spent the subsequent 5 years in the specific and demanding professional apprenticeship that wartime military logistics provides. Trained at the Heeresschule für Nachschubwesen in Berlin on the most rigorous military supply doctrine in the world, and refined by the operational experience of campaigns whose supply challenges have pushed him and every Wehrmacht logistics professional against the limits of what military supply systems can achieve. He has managed the logistics of operations from the France campaign's 1940 road network in the Ardennes to the Russian steppes' Rasputitsa mud seasons to the North African desert's heat and distance. He has never encountered, in those 5 years of the most intensive military logistics operations in history, a number like 12,500 tons per day, delivered over 400 miles on the road network available, delivered not by a systematic logistics infrastructure, but by a trucking circuit that has been operational for 4 days. The German supply planning formula, built from 4 years of accumulated Wehrmacht logistics experience on the Eastern Front and in the Mediterranean, and in the Normandy defensive period, and calibrated against the specific performance data of the German military's own trucking fleet, primarily the Opel Blitz 3-ton truck and the Klöckner Deutz 3-ton truck, whose operational performance data across the full range of weather, terrain, and operational tempo conditions has provided the calibration database for the formula's vehicle utilization coefficients, says that a trucking fleet of 6,000 vehicles can sustain approximately 4,000 tons per day over a 400-mile route under optimal conditions. Not 12,500. 4,000. Optimal. The formula has produced this number from the vehicle payload specification, the vehicle fuel consumption rate, the road surface coefficient for northern French roads, the driver sustainable duty hour limit, and the maintenance to operation ratio that the Wehrmacht's maintenance organization experience defines as the minimum required to prevent progressive fleet degradation. Every input is correctly calculated from real operational data. The output is 4,000 tons per day. The Red Ball is producing 12,500. What the Americans are doing, according to the report that Reuter is reading, is delivering 3 times the tonnage that his formula projects as achievable with the vehicles committed, on roads that the formula's terrain coefficient scores as below optimal, with a vehicle maintenance organization that the intelligence assessment describes as improvised rather than systematic. Reuter underlines his annotation again, with the specific emphasis of a professional who has checked his arithmetic twice and found that the arithmetic is correct, and the phenomenon it is describing is impossible, and that these 2 facts must coexist in the reality he is trying to analyze. Then he writes a second note in the margin, beneath the underlined "Das ist unmöglich," in the smaller and more careful handwriting of a man who is composing a question whose answer he cannot derive from his professional knowledge. How? Not how is the Red Ball Express operating. The intelligence report has described the operation's structure, and it is comprehensible as a concept. How is it producing these numbers from this structure, from these vehicles, on these roads, with this maintenance organization? The Red Ball Express is not just beating the German supply formula's projection. It is beating it by a factor of 3, in ways that the German professional logistics framework has no adequate explanation for. And in the next 70 days, the Red Ball Express will deliver more than 400,000 tons of ammunition, fuel, and supplies to the Allied armies, pursuing the German army toward its own border, through the autumn of 1944, whose operational outcome will be shaped as much by the supply chain's performance as by the fighting performance of the armies it is supplying, delivering them in quantities that the German army's own logistics system cannot match on its side of the front, delivering them at speeds that the German defensive reconstitution cannot outpace, and delivering them through a system whose fundamental operating principles the German supply officer examining the intelligence report cannot reconcile with any logistics doctrine he has ever been taught. The American logistics challenge in the summer of 1944 is, in the formal language of military supply planning, the Allied armies that broke out of the Normandy beachhead in the last week of July and first week of August, the American breakout at Avranches, and the subsequent exploitation that has been the fastest large-scale armored advance the Western theater has produced, have been advancing at rates that the invasion's pre-operational logistics planning, developed by the most thorough logistics planning organization the American military has ever assembled, had not projected as achievable in the first 90 days of the campaign, on the grounds that the German defensive resistance, whose intensity and duration the planning had projected as the primary constraint on the advance rate, would prevent this pace of advance. The planning had assumed a deliberate advance against sustained German resistance, the kind of advance that the Italian campaign's experience and the Normandy beachhead's 2-month fighting had established as the baseline projection for what the Allied armies could achieve against a competent German defense, an advance measured in miles per week rather than miles per day, an advance whose pace would allow the supply system's infrastructure to develop at a rate compatible with the advancing front's requirements. The railway extensions, the pipeline extensions, the forward supply depot construction that the logistics planning had scheduled against the advance rate that the planning projected as realistic. The planning was wrong in the specific and operationally consequential way that military logistics planning is wrong when the campaign's operational outcome departs from the planning baseline by the margin that the August breakout has produced. The advance has been measured in miles per day, sometimes tens of miles per day, at the pace that the Normandy breakout's momentum and the German army's operational collapse west of the Seine have allowed the exploitation to achieve. And the supply infrastructure that the planning projected would be in place to support the front at its current position in the week of August 25 has not been built because the infrastructure development schedule was keyed to the advance rate that the planning projected and that the advance has dramatically exceeded. The railheads are 400 miles behind the front. The pipeline infrastructure is 400 miles behind the front. The pre-positioned supply depots that the planning calculated would be available to support the current front position at its late August location are 400 miles behind the front. Everything that the pre-operational planning calculated as available to the armies pursuing the German retreat across France is 400 miles behind where the armies actually are, separated from the armies by the fastest large-scale advance that the Western theater has produced, and by a road network that the planning's infrastructure development schedule has not had time to organize with the rail and pipeline extensions that the plan had projected would be in place. The gap between what the plan projected would be available and what is actually available at the front's current position is the Red Ball Express's reason for existing. The Red Ball Express is not a planned logistics operation in the sense that the pre-operational planning documents created it. It is the emergency improvisation of a logistics system that has been planned to exist in a more developed form once the infrastructure can be built but has not yet been built. A trucking operation that substitutes vehicle velocity for infrastructure whose absence the velocity compensates for, at a cost. Vehicle consumption that the operations designers have accepted as the operational trade-off between having the supplies at the front now and having a more sustainable supply system 3 weeks from now, when the front is 200 miles further east and 3 weeks earlier, might have made the critical difference. It uses the roads whose only consistent characteristic is that they exist and connect the supply depots to the front, roads that have been maintained by the French highway system to varying standards, that have been degraded by the German retreat's systematic destruction of bridges and road surfaces in the sectors where the German command has had time to conduct the destruction, and that have been further degraded by the Allied advances' tracked vehicles and artillery, and the weather that August in Normandy and northwestern France produces. And it asks of the drivers and the vehicles and the maintenance organization what no German logistics planner's formula has ever asked of any of those elements, because no German logistics planning has ever produced a situation whose operational requirement created the specific operational incentive to find out, to operate beyond the theoretical maximum in the specific service of an operational situation that the theoretical maximum was not designed to accommodate. The German military supply system that Reuter has spent his career in is built on principles whose validity the German army's logistics experience has consistently confirmed across 5 years of operations in every environment and at every operational tempo that modern warfare has produced. Principles that have been tested in the specific and demanding laboratory of the Wehrmacht's campaigns, and whose violation has produced the documented outcomes that the German logistics system has been analyzing and incorporating into its doctrine since each violation first appeared in the operational record. The principles are that vehicle utilization rates must be kept within the sustainable maintenance threshold that the vehicle's design specification and the available maintenance organization's capacity define, because utilization beyond this threshold accelerates the breakdown rate in the compounding way that a maintenance backlog's growth beyond the maintenance capacity's ability to clear it produces, that supply routes must be managed with the systematic traffic control and route maintenance procedures that prevent the road degradation whose compounding effect on vehicle consumption would eventually exceed the route's supply delivery benefit. The road that carries twice its sustainable traffic load degrades at 4 times the rate. A compounding relationship that the German logistics experience has documented precisely. That the supply calculation must account for the vehicle fleet's consumption of its own supplies, the fuel and the maintenance parts and the driver hours that the delivery vehicles themselves require, in the projections of net deliverable tonnage at the receiving end of the route. And that the human element of the logistics operation, the drivers, the loaders, the mechanics, must be managed within the sustainable work schedules that the human body's physical limits define as the maximum serviceable output rate, beyond which error rates increase, decision quality degrades, and the human performance factor in the formula becomes unreliable. Each of these principles is correct. Each of them is the distilled lesson of operational experience, whose violation has produced, in every instance that the German logistics record contains, as a documented operational outcome, the specific and compounding failure of a supply operation that has been pushed beyond its sustainable parameters. The failure whose earliest indicators are the vehicle breakdown rate exceeding the maintenance repair rate, followed by the route surface degradation that overtaxed road maintenance cannot arrest, followed by the driver performance degradation that insufficient rest produces in a human population operating at the physiological boundary of functional performance. The German supply formula is not conservative in the sense of applying safety margins whose purpose is the protection of the logistics officer's career from the consequences of underperformance. It is calibrated in the sense of describing the actual relationship between operational demand, material capacity, and human physical limits, as the German logistics system has documented those relationships across the most extensive and most systematically analyzed military logistics operations in history. And what the Red Ball Express is doing is not operating beyond the sustainable parameters in the temporary way that a specific emergency situation justifies. The two-day push that accepts increased vehicle consumption in exchange for a critical delivery, after which the fleet is given recovery time. It is operating beyond those parameters continuously, for 70 days, at tonnage rates that the German formula projects will produce a catastrophic vehicle fleet degradation within 3 weeks of sustained operation. 3 weeks have passed. 4 weeks, 5 weeks. The fleet has not catastrophically degraded. The Red Ball is still running. August 29th, 1944. The Red Ball Express route, France. At any given moment on the circuit between Saint-Lô and the advancing front, there are more than 5,000 trucks in motion simultaneously, a column of vehicles that, if placed bumper to bumper on a single road, would stretch approximately 650 miles, from Paris to the Swiss border and back. Their combined engine noise is audible for miles in every direction. Their combined dust cloud is visible from aircraft. The trucks are primarily the 2.5-ton GMC 6W, the 6x6 workhorse that the American military has been producing at the rate of approximately 21,000 vehicles per month during the war's peak production period, and that the Lend-Lease program has been distributing to the Soviet Union. Britain, and every allied nation whose logistics require vehicle augmentation at a rate whose total production figure of 562,750 vehicles by the time the Red Ball begins, represents the most massive single-type vehicle production in the history of warfare. The vehicle whose design specification lists its optimal load as 2.5 tons. The vehicle whose Red Ball operators are routinely loading with 5 tons because the operational requirement says 5 tons, and because the truck, in the specific and pragmatic assessment of the men who drive it, and who know this truck's capabilities in the empirical way that comes from driving it at its limit, can carry 5 tons without immediate breakdown, even if the specification says 2.5. The overloading is not authorized. It is also not prohibited by any Red Ball directive that would be enforced against a driver who is delivering tonnage at twice the specification's rate, in service of an operational requirement that the armies at the front have described as critical. The German supply formula, which has been calculated using each vehicle type's specified load, rather than the load that the vehicle's operators are actually carrying, has been projecting Red Ball tonnage capability from a baseline that is half what the operation is actually achieving per vehicle. The formula is wrong by half at the per-vehicle level before any other input error is considered. The route is organized as a one-way circuit. The operational concept that the Red Ball's planners, working from the basic principle that a dedicated one-way road can carry twice the traffic of a two-way road at the same vehicle spacing and at a higher safe operating speed, have translated into the specific Red Ball implementation in the 72 hours between the decision to create the circuit and its first operational day. Trucks move east on dedicated Red Ball roads, whose right-of-way designation has been enforced by the military police traffic controllers, positioned at every major junction to hold all non-Red Ball traffic while the loaded trucks pass. Turn north and west at the railheads nearest the front, after discharging their loads to the forward supply points, where the Army's quartermaster detachments are managing the distribution, and return west on a separate designated route whose one-way westbound designation allows the eastbound loaded trucks to move without the delay that the opposing traffic stream would produce on a two-way road. The trucks on the westbound return route travel empty and fast, covering the 400 miles back to the Saint-Lô area supply depots in the minimum time that the road surface conditions and the driver's sustained attention allow. The organization of this circuit has been accomplished in 72 hours from the decision to create it. The operational order issued on August 23rd by Brigadier General Everett Hughes of the Communications Zone, following the conference with Lieutenant General John Lee's Services of Supply Headquarters, that has identified the supply crisis and committed to the trucking solution. The first trucks rolling on August 25th, the full circuit with its traffic control stations and its one-way designations established and operational. In 72 hours, the American Logistics Organization has established what the German Logistics Doctrine's planning methodology, whose project management framework for supply route infrastructure development has been refined from the Wehrmacht's accumulated campaign experience in 4 operational theaters. Schedule is a minimum 3-week infrastructure development project requiring advanced reconnaissance, route survey, traffic control station construction, and the training of the traffic control personnel, whose deployment is the prerequisite for the managed vehicle flow that the one-way circuit's efficiency requires. The American organization has established it not with the comprehensive planning and systematic preparation that the German logistics doctrine prescribes as the minimum acceptable development procedure for a supply route of this scale and operational significance, but with the improvised efficiency of an organization that has been told to solve a problem and has looked at the available resources, the trucks, the drivers, the roads, the traffic controllers who are learning the job by doing it on the first day of the circuit's operation, and decided that the problem can be solved with those resources if the resources are applied at rates the specification does not recommend, and at a pace that the planning methodology's minimum timeline does not contemplate. The German supply officer's formula says this circuit cannot be functioning at this efficiency in 72 hours with this level of preparation. The circuit is functioning. The near failure in the Red Ball Express's remarkable run, the moment that comes closest to producing the fleet degradation that the German formula has been projecting since the operation began, arrives in the second week of September 1944, when the combination of the accelerating advances increasing route length, the accumulating vehicle maintenance deficit that has been building since August 25 as the overloaded trucks run at utilization rates that exceed the maintenance organization's sustainable repair capacity, and the specific shortage of fuel at the forward depots that the Red Ball itself is attempting to address, produces what the transportation officers managing the circuit describe in their operational logs as a crisis of compounding deficits. The route has extended from 400 miles to 500 miles as the front moves east. The vehicle maintenance backlog, the trucks that are out of service awaiting repair at rates that the maintenance battalions cannot clear because the maintenance battalions are also running at utilization rates beyond their sustainable capacity, has grown from approximately 300 vehicles in the first week to approximately 900 vehicles by September 7th. The driver shortage, which has been masked by the emergency scheduling of drivers for 18 to 20-hour days since August 25, has become acute as the accumulated fatigue of 2 weeks of emergency operations produces a driver population whose error rate and whose physical capacity to sustain the driving pace the circuit requires is approaching its limit. Lieutenant Colonel Lauren Ayers, the Transportation Corps officer, who has been managing the Red Ball's vehicle maintenance program since August 25, reviews the September 7 deficit numbers and writes in his operational log that the circuit is at risk of losing its operational coherence within 10 days if the maintenance backlog cannot be reduced and the driver schedule cannot be moderated. He does not moderate the driver schedule. He cannot moderate the driver schedule because the armies at the front require the tonnage the current schedule is producing, and the armies at the front are fighting battles whose outcome depends on receiving that tonnage. Battles on the German border, and across the Moselle, and at Metz, and along the supply lines that connect the fighting front to the Red Ball's forward delivery points. Battles whose daily ammunition consumption and whose daily fuel consumption represent numbers that the Red Ball's current tonnage delivery is barely meeting, and that any reduction in the Red Ball's pace would immediately fail to meet. Ayers instead redirects maintenance teams from the route's western sector, where the trucks are closest to the Normandy depots and whose lesser repair priority can absorb the team reduction, to the forward depots, where the backlog is most acute, cannibalizing components from the most damaged vehicles to restore the less damaged ones to service in the specific and operationally justified approach of a maintenance officer who understands that one running truck is worth more than 2 damaged trucks, and that the cannibalization that produces one runner from 2 damaged vehicles is the correct answer to a parts shortage, whose resolution through the standard supply channel will take longer than the circuit can sustain the backlog. The maintenance team's own working hours are extended to match the driver's extended schedules. The near failure is addressed by the application of the same operational logic that created the conditions for the near failure. More of everything, faster, for longer than the specification says is sustainable. The German supply formula has been projecting this approach as the accelerant of the catastrophic degradation. The catastrophic degradation does not arrive. The racial dimension of the Red Ball Express is the element that German supply officers, examining the operation's numbers, find most analytically challenging to incorporate into their professional assessment, and the element that the post-war foreign military studies interviews reveal as producing the most significant confusion in the German logistical analysis of why the operation achieved the numbers it achieved. Approximately 75% of the Red Ball's drivers are Black American soldiers, soldiers from the segregated service units, whose assignment to the Transportation Corps and the Quartermaster Corps reflects the specific and documented racial policy of the American Army of 1944. A policy that assigns black soldiers primarily to service and support roles on the basis of an institutional assessment of their combat suitability that has been implemented through the Army's general order system since the conflict began, and that the historical record will eventually identify as one of the most consequential failures of the American military's Second World War personnel policy. A failure whose operational consequences include the specific and documented failure to utilize Black American soldiers' full military potential in the combat arms, while directing them into service roles whose performance, in the specific case of the Red Ball Express, has been more operationally significant than the planners who designed the racial assignment policy had projected when they defined service roles as secondary. The 3,500 black drivers who constitute this workforce are soldiers who have been told, by the Army's institutional policy and by the American society whose racial structure the Army reflects, that their contribution to the war effort is secondary. They are delivering tonnage numbers that make their contribution to the Allied Army's operational capability in August and September 1944 anything but secondary. The German logistics analysis of the Red Ball Express is constructed from the intelligence picture of an American military that the German intelligence assessment has described as organized along racial allocation principles, analogous to those that structure the German military's own personnel system. The assessment that the primary combat and operational roles in the American Army would be assigned to white soldiers, and that black soldiers, whose presence in the American Army the intelligence reports have noted as significant in numerical terms, would be in secondary roles with secondary operational significance, roles whose contribution to the American Army's overall operational capability would be proportionally secondary to the contribution of the primary white soldier population. The assumption is the product of an intelligence system applying its own cultural framework, the racially stratified framework of German ideology's military application, to the analysis of a different military culture, and producing from that application an analysis that says more about the German intelligence framework than it says about the American Army. The numbers the Red Ball is producing do not match this assumption. The 3,500 black drivers, who are moving between 50 and 60% of the Red Ball's daily tonnage, are not secondary operational contributors whose performance is supported and made possible by the primary white soldier workforce that the German intelligence framework has assumed as the operation's functional foundation. They are, by the operation's tonnage accounting, and by any operational analysis that treats delivered tonnage as the primary performance metric, the operational center of gravity of the largest and most significant logistics operation the Allied war effort has produced in the European theater. The German supply officer's analysis cannot produce a formula for how a workforce that the German professional framework has categorized as secondary, on the basis of the racial hierarchy whose applicability the German analysis has assumed, extends to the American military's institutional structure, is producing primary operational results, because the categorization is wrong, and the formula built on the categorization produces a projection that the actual numbers refute. The German professional framework has no mechanism for correcting the categorization. The error compounds. The Red Ball Express closes on November 16, 1944, having operated for 81 days and delivered approximately 412,193 tons of supplies to the Allied armies across a total of approximately 10,000 vehicle round trips. These are the numbers that the German supply officer's post-war analysis eventually compiles from the captured American logistics records and from the American operational histories that the occupation period's cooperative historical research has made available. Numbers that the German logistics officers, who examine them in the specific and professional context of the Foreign Military Studies program's structured interviews, do so with the analytical detachment that the war's end and the distance of several years has provided, analyzing the operation that defeated them with the professional rigor that the German military's intellectual culture has always applied to the analysis of operational outcomes. The professional reaction to the numbers, documented in the Foreign Military Studies interviews with German logistics officers that the American Army's historical program conducted in the late 1940s in the camps and the offices where the post-war accounting has been proceeding, is the reaction of practitioners encountering numbers that their professional framework says are impossible, and that the documentary record and the physical evidence of the Allied campaign's operational outcome says are real. The reaction has two components, each representing a different level of the professional analytical process that the Foreign Military Studies interviews reveal as the German logistics officers' characteristic response to operational data that contradicts their professional framework. The first is the professional acknowledgement that the American logistics system's improvised response to an unprecedented supply challenge has achieved a result that the German logistical planning methodology's formula would not have projected as achievable with the available resources on the available road network in the available time. The acknowledgement is honest and specific in the way that professional assessments by practitioners who have been trained to value analytical accuracy over professional defensiveness are honest and specific. The formula was wrong about the result. The formula's failure to project the result reflects not a deficiency in the formula's mathematical validity. The formula correctly describes the relationship between the inputs it was designed to accommodate, but a deficiency in one of its inputs, the human input, the assumption about what the people operating the system will do when the operational requirement exceeds the specification's sustainable limit. The German formula's human input has been calibrated from German soldiers operating in a system whose institutional culture enforces specification adherence, and whose command culture does not historically accommodate the improvised departure from specification that the Red Ball has been performing continuously for 81 days. The German formula's human input has been calibrated from German soldiers operating in a system that enforces adherence to specification, a system whose institutional culture does not accommodate the sustained operation beyond specification that the Red Ball's drivers and mechanics and traffic controllers have been delivering for 81 days because the system's institutional culture tells them to solve the problem, and they have decided that operating beyond specification is how the problem gets solved. The second reaction is the professional question that the Foreign Military Studies interviews preserve in the specific and honest language of German logistics officers who are conducting the post-war analysis that the American Army's historical program has invited them to contribute. How? The answer to how in the specific and documented accounts of the black drivers who drove 18-hour days across the Normandy bocage and the Seine Valley and the approaches to the German border, and the white mechanics who cannibalized their best trucks to keep the worst ones running through nights, that the September darkness made 16 hours long, and the transportation officers who rerouted and rescheduled and improvised for 81 consecutive days in service of a tonnage requirement that never decreased as the front moved further east, is the same answer that the American military's European campaign keeps producing when German professional observers ask how the Americans have done what the German professional framework said could not be done. They did it because they had to, because the armies at the front needed the supplies, needed the gasoline for the Shermans, and the artillery shells for the guns, and the rations for the men, and the medical supplies for the wounded, whose care requires what they require, regardless of what the supply formula says is deliverable. Because someone was depending on the tonnage. Because in the American military's specific and cultural relationship to the impossible, the fact that the formula says something cannot be done has never been the last word, has always been the first question, the opening challenge to the individuals and the organization's applied ingenuity to find the way that the formula missed. The Red Ball Express made no sense on paper. It made complete sense on the road, driven by men who were not reading the paper.